Okay. Assalamu alaikum and good afternoon, everyone. I hope you can hear me clearly. Assalamu alaikum and good afternoon, everyone. I welcome you all on board on behalf of Department of Gender and Development Studies. Uh, Up till now, we have heard a lot about the current pandemic and all its effects and everything. Basically, today we are here to have a gendered perspective of current pandemic. So before going into the details of this program or this webinar, I would just like to tell you that we are having with us the national and international speakers. And before going to the detail, I will hand over to Dr. Talat, Professor Dr. Talat Suhail, Director Will, to inaugurate the session and welcome the guests. Dr. Talat.
Alaikum to all valued speakers, especially Dr. Maria from University of Bristol, UK, Professor Georgina from University of Manchester, UK, and Dr. Aurangzeb from Balochistan University, and especially our Vice Chancellor who's also there. Look for Women Institute for Leadership and Learning, popularly known as WIL, Lahore College Women University, was established in the year 2004, under which Department of Gender Studies and Development, Department of Sociology, and Student Service Center exists, which offers counseling services to both faculty and students of Lahore College Women University under the supervision of certified and trained clinical psychologists. Will has young, dynamic, committed faculty and staff who have successfully organized a number of international and national conferences, seminars, and training workshops for both faculty and students. Will has developed a well reputed linkages program with international and national universities, and it works in close association with a large number of international and national provincial level organizations for gender equality and empowerment. In the current pandemic which we are facing, make people realize that the developing and underdeveloping economies and societies were not prepared to meet the challenges of any crisis such as this pandemic. Closure of universities, schools, and educational institutions, because all educational institutions and offices had to urgently adopt and adapt to online teaching, for which not only infrastructure and technology was needed, but also training of faculty, staff, and students. The real challenge was the adjustment and attitude towards this digital change. The student teacher direct interaction, face to face interaction was not there. So, all teaching, workshops, conferences, project meetings, all are affected due to COVID-19 smart lockdown. In the current pandemic, women's domestic workload has increased, online office work has increased, more monitoring of children and men at home, nursing the sick, economic insecurity and poverty of women on daily wages has increased. Quarantine and social isolation has added to mental stress and disorders. Reduced availability of health services has created fear and phobia of being a victim of coronavirus, and many more challenges which women face today, along with the past baggage of previous gender issues like gender discrimination, gender violence, and gender harassment. I, Dr. Talat Suhail, Director, will really appreciate the efforts and hard work of Dr. Subha Malik, Chair, Department of Gender Studies and Development, her faculty and students for organizing this much needed webinar. I treasure the support provided by the Vice Chancellor Dr. Bushra Mirza. I also appreciate Mass Communication Department, especially Dr. Anjum Sia and Mr. Naveed and the Web TV staff for their technical support. I am certain that this webinar, Gender Dynamics in Current Pandemic, will provide new ideas, new dimensions, new perspectives that will enable women through policy development and support to be prepared to meet the challenges of any crisis in future. I hope all participants of webinar will benefit from it. Best of luck. Thank you so much. Alaikum to all.
Thank you, Dr. Talat, for your kind words. Thank you, ma'am. It would be of interest for all of you that this webinar will continue without Zoom meeting end because we are using LCWU's paid account. And secondly, the session is also being telecasted live on LCWU Web TV. I will humbly request all the speakers to please follow the time limit. Today, our first speaker in this webinar is Dr. Maria Fannin. Dr. Fannin is currently Human Geographic Research Director in the School of Geographical Sciences, University of Bristol, UK. She completed her master's and PhD in Human Geography at the University of Washington in Seattle. Her master's and PhD research focused broadly on the spaces and politics of home birth and midwifery, specifically in the United States, Canada, and France. Her research continues on to focus on the body and health, and for the last few years have carried out research projects related to stem cell donation, commercial blood storage, and more recently, she is working on the history of a placenta biobank. Today, she will share with us her views related to gender dynamics in UK. I'm sorry, in UK. Dr. Fannin, on to you.
Thank you very much for a really kind introduction. And yes, I had to remember to put my audio on. It still feels like after many months now of online working that I'm still adjusting to, to some of the technologies. So um, apologies also for for arriving a bit late. That was just updating my Zoom account so that I can also now organize meetings through my institution that are beyond the free account and so on. I want to thank especially those who invited me to participate in this webinar, and especially Medea Nadine, who is here visiting in the UK, the University of Bristol's Geography Department, obviously working remotely, but I'm very pleased that I was able to speak to you today, and also Dr. Sheila for all the invitation, and really the Department of Gender and Development Studies for organizing and hosting this event. So I thought it would be useful to speak to you about some of the dynamics that are taking place around the COVID pandemic here in the UK, some of which I think will be very familiar because they're, I think, part of how scholars of gender around the world have been looking at the effects of the pandemic on women and on men. and on the gender dynamics that relate to both health as well as the economic dimensions of the pandemic, which I think are going to be rippling out from now into the future and perhaps quite far into the future. And some of the dynamics, of course, are also going to be specific to context. So as a geographer, one of the things that I'm and my colleagues are very attentive to, or try to be attentive to, is how specificity matters, place matters, and where one is located matters. And so some of these dynamics that I'll be speaking of may be, I think, reflective of global dynamics related to how gender operates and how gender operates as a way of differentiating social relations and social roles, but some of those will also be perhaps specific to the UK. And I'm really interested in hearing in the questions and the discussion how we can think about connections between what context we're all working in and how that makes a difference. So I think it's very clear to many who have been reflecting on the gender dynamics of the pandemic that there are significant kind of exacerbation of inequalities that we have seen. So it's clear that some of the health dimensions of the pandemic have revealed that, in fact, women are much at this stage. I mean, the data is still being analyzed. That women are not as significantly affected in general by the health implications of COVID-19, of the virus itself, and certainly in the UK, it has been the case that men have been more likely to develop serious illness, and women more likely to, however, be in positions where they might be exposed and at risk to exposure from the virus. And I'll speak a bit more about that. Of course, for the elderly population, that means because women tend to statistically live longer lives, they tend to live in care homes and in some of the places in the UK that have been the hardest hit by the virus, by the health effects of the virus. And what that means is that, you know, they're exposed to higher risk, but have actually not, as far as we're able to tell from some of the data that has been released, have not been as severely affected by serious illness as men have. And the dynamics of that are still, I think, you know, are being worked through. You know, does it relate to some of the comorbidities, as they're called, of what those who are elderly might also be experiencing, who may then be at higher risk of having a serious illness? What exactly is related to maybe the kinds of health conditions that men may be more likely in later years to have, and how does that relate to some of the social dynamics around work, and so on? These are questions that I think are still quite open questions for researchers. But it's also very clear that some of the social impacts of the virus and the pandemic and the lockdown have been very unevenly distributed across society, and that the impacts of COVID-19 and the lockdown and the economic impacts of the virus and the economic crisis that we are anticipating will unfold as the virus continues to shape how we work and how we live. This is where I think a lot of attention is being paid, you know, to looking at some of the statistics that are really showing up how women and men are being differentially impacted by the virus. And I'll just talk through some of those. So it's very clear for us in the UK, women make up the majority of healthcare workers. About 78% of healthcare workers are women, and this is, you know, this does mean, and that includes both care workers who might work in people's homes, who might work in care homes, nurses, and so on. They make up the majority of low-paid workers in the healthcare sector, and the majority of carers, women do. They're more likely in those, and because of that, to be living in poverty, and more likely to rely on health services or public services, and therefore more likely to be put at risk. Women in the labor force are more likely to be working in some of the high-risk occupations, not just in the healthcare sector, but also in those occupations where they are key workers, and in some cases exposed on a daily basis to a higher risk of being exposed to the virus. So working in supermarkets and retail, some of the supermarket retail or sort of, frontline key worker, essential retail services that have been open throughout the lockdown. And of course, in the service sector, as businesses start to reopen, it is often those positions of working as cashiers, working in the service industries, in restaurants, and in other kind of sectors of kind of the entertainment industry that are reopening that will put potentially women at higher risk. So that's some of the labor dynamics that I think we see unfolding in the pandemic. That women are differentially exposed because of gender segregation that already exists in the labor market. And in many ways, because of the nature of the work that they are involved in, may be more likely to expose others because of their work in these sectors, because it involves, in some cases, intimate contact with others, nursing being a very kind of, a kind of bodily labor in many ways. But it's clear that, as was mentioned in the introduction, that the unpaid work and the unpaid care, the domestic work that is carried out to support, to support the economy, is also differentially impacting women. That it was the case before the pandemic that women did more of this work in the home, and therefore the burden that has fallen on women in lockdown conditions, especially those who are parents, and especially those who are parents without any other help, so lone mothers or single parents, has increased this burden of domestic care and the kind of financial implications of that. It's very clear that, as we've seen, working from home unfold and the kind of conditions under which workers are being asked to work from home, that is possible for some, but not possible for others. And some of the research that's been done that's reflecting on this context in the UK has said, well, it's actually women who are really hit hardest at the lower paid sectors of the economy because they cannot work from home, and therefore are experiencing either conditions of being put on furlough, but potentially also losing their jobs. It's been said that the lockdown conditions of work from home and the transfer of work to the home place might shift gender dynamics, might shift how those who are not necessarily always involved in as much of the domestic labor, so men in partnered relationships, perhaps might take on more of the care work. And I think that's certainly something that anecdotally has been reflected in the way in which people have written about what it's like to be a home based worker, and what it's like to be then trying to juggle, if one has caring responsibilities, that between men and women working. But I think it remains to be seen to what extent that will continue, or to what extent that burden has really been, has shifted some of the dynamics, the kind of cultural dynamics around gendered care work and who does work in homes. So I think it's very clear that the economic impacts of the lockdown have been differentially experienced, and there's a clear gender dynamic to who has been more significantly affected in terms of the social and cultural, differentiations or divisions of labor that already exist in the UK. That women have been more likely to hold insecure part-time and low-wage jobs before the pandemic hit, and so they are in a position of more vulnerability as the economic impacts of this virus really begin to ripple out after and the kind of financial impacts of the virus began to ripple out. And this has resulted in, I think, many calls to try to think very carefully about how policies can be shaped to benefit and to really actually shift the gender dynamics around labor and the gender dynamics around work and life and home and care in the UK. And I think a very, kind of compelling call has been made by one commentator that, we have a lot of language now of the new normal, that the new normal is, home-based work, it's video technology, it's for those of us in education, it's going to be online learning, it's wearing masks when we're out and about, it's social distancing and trying to kind of really normalize many of these things that are these practices that are going to protect us, potentially, hopefully protect us, and protect the most vulnerable from the exposure to the virus. But I think one of the commentators who was writing about gender dynamics in the UK said, we really need to think about what kind of normal life before lockdown we don't want to return to. And that is, the conditions under which these gender differences really put women, and certainly women who are who are in who are in more vulnerable situations before the pandemic. We don't want to kind of go back to that normal. And actually, our new normal now should be really thinking hard about what policies can be enacted to shape the future beyond lockdown, potentially beyond coronavirus, but potentially living with this virus for some time. And I think just to end with a few kind of comments about what needs to happen in that context. Well, we need to see more visible kind of analysis of the gender dynamics in the lockdown, under these conditions, and in the economy more generally. We need to see more visible attention to these kinds of issues in the highest levels of policy making, where it hasn't necessarily been something that we have seen so visibly. And certainly one of those, one of the kind of points that I think draws this out really starkly is that, and this has very much to do with the economic impacts of COVID-19, is some consternation about the reopening of entertainment venues, of bars, of restaurants, and not so much about the kinds of impacts of keeping limited access to schools, to nurseries, and so on for those who are trying to balance childcare and work from home. I think we need to be thinking in policies around safety and how to make workplaces and make public spaces more safe. And this has really been, I think, brought to a head when we've looked at the local lockdown that occurred in Leicester in the UK, which is a center for garment manufacturing in the UK. It was very clear from some of the early reports of what was happening, a spike in coronavirus cases, which led some journalists to try to investigate what was happening in Leicester, that actually this spike in coronavirus cases was very much, it seemed, led by or kind of clustered in the garment manufacturing sites where low-paid workers, paid in many cases almost half of the minimum wage, were working in unsafe conditions, and that this really brought almost a kind of national attention to the plight of workers there, mostly non-unionized, that had actually been brought up over many years by local MPs and activists. But I think, that has brought, I think, to the fore this question of how to make workplaces safe and the conditions under which some workers today in the UK are working in very unsafe conditions, and that includes women and men. To support parents, there have been calls to increase the kind of social provisions like child benefit that might help working parents who are taking care of children while also trying to work. To support educational institutions to provide the equipment that children will need. Certainly this kind of moment is passing insofar as we're now moving into a break from schools, but that will be restarting in the autumn. Certainly many schools, I think, are trying to reopen, but what will that look like and what resources are needed? And then I think also trying to think about those who are at the most vulnerable in society, thinking about women who make up a disproportionate number of homeless, looking at women who are in prisons, speeding up the kind of early release policies for prisoners, for women prisoners, for thinking about all the kinds of crises that women face with the increase in domestic violence. And so resourcing for domestic violence protection for women who are invulnerable, who have now, I think it's very clear in the conditions of lockdown, been very much more put at risk to gender-based violence in the home. And certainly we've seen an increase in reporting of gender-based violence incidents in the UK. So I want to close, I think, with those comments that there's a lot of thinking going on in the UK from those who are scholars of gender around how to implement some of these, how to make more visible some of these concerns at a high level. I think we're fighting a very difficult battle given the current government, and yet we've seen quite swift moves to put resources in particular sectors of the economy and to really, in many cases, end some of the austerity or certainly speak of ending the austerity policies that have really affected many over the last many years since the financial crisis. So we can see reversals of policy when there is a perception of urgent need, and I think that should galvanize many of us who are hopeful that those who have the resources to be able to think and think critically and speak to policymakers about these kinds of issues will be able to enact some kind of change, to not return us to all of what used to be our normal, and to think about what the new normal might be in relationship to gender equality, equity, and I think justice. So I'll close there. It's maybe I have maybe few more minutes, but I don't want to take up too much. I sort of have kept an eye on the time. I'm not sure how I'm gone. Hopefully that's within time. So thank you very much and look forward to questions.
Thank you very much, Dr. Fannin. We'll definitely have the questions, but at the end of the session. Uh, Thank you so much for your insight and your the thing you shared with us relating to the workplaces, and I second your opinion that policymakers and the people who are in authority positions should definitely look into the matters and to do the needful.
Mm.
Thank you so very much. So our second speaker for today's webinar is Dr. Georgina Whelan. She's a professor of politics at the University of Manchester, UK, and has a vast experience of teaching in UK, USA, Canada, and South Africa as well. She is a co-director of the Feminism and Institutionalism International Network and a member of the Academy of Social Sciences. Her main research interest lies in the field of comparative politics, political economy, with a focus on gender and politics, international political economy, transition to democracy, and governance and institutions. Today, she will share with us her views related to gender, leadership, and COVID-19. Over to you, Dr. Whelan.
Great. Thank you very much. And thank you for the very kind introduction and for the invitation to speak today. And as you know, I'm a political scientist. And so what I'm going to talk about today is some of the recent debates about whether female leaders like Jacinta Ardern in New Zealand and Angela Merkel in Germany have been better at dealing with COVID than male leaders, particularly ones like Boris Johnson that we have here in the UK, or Trump in the States, or Bolsonaro in Brazil, just because they are women. And what I'm going to do is use a kind of gendered institutional or a feminist institutional approach. It was mentioned in the introduction that I'm involved in trying to develop a feminist institutionalism to try and analyse some of the debates about leadership during the COVID-19 pandemic. And feminist institutionalism is giving us, I think, an increasingly useful way of analysing gender and politics and the relationship between gendered actors and gendered institutions. So what I'm going to do is use some ideas from that. Firstly, the idea of critical junctures, that the COVID pandemic is a critical juncture, and related to this, how it can give us a particular focus in terms of how we understand this relationship between gendered political institutions and gendered political actors in the pandemic. So really, we're thinking about, in this time of crisis, how much difference do leaders make? So I'm arguing that the COVID crisis is a critical juncture. It's a context where gendered agency is much more important. So actors like political leaders can make much more of a difference, if you like, than they often can do in so-called normal times. But it's far too simplistic to say in any meaningful way that female leaders are better than male leaders for a number of very important reasons. And I'll only be able to skim the surface of the arguments today, but just outline a bit of them. So the first starting point is what is a critical juncture, and what does it actually mean for us to say the current COVID crisis is a critical juncture? Now, it's a key concept for those of you familiar with sort of historical institutionalist theory, and it's used a lot by feminist institutionalist scholars. And it's basically talking about a context which doesn't happen very often. It's a situation of uncertainty, and it's a time when choice and political agency come to the fore, and the decisions taken have important long-term legacies. So in institutional speak, it's a time when a lot of decisions will create path dependencies, sort of set the train for what polities and states will do. And critical junctures are often come about as the result of a big sort of external exogenous shock, if you like, a war, the Great Depression, some unexpected event from outside. And I think we can see that this is the case for COVID-19. The risk of a pandemic was known about for a long time and even planned for to varying extents, but no one knew exactly when and how a sort of global pandemic would take place. So a critical juncture then, it's a time of contingency when sort of different options are open, and there's a bigger range of choices in some ways for actors to make. So Maria mentioned that we're seeing economic policies, huge amounts of state intervention being undertaken by some governments that usually are completely opposed to such actions. So measures to support economies that if you said 6 months ago would be taking place, people would have just thought you had gone completely mad. But I think it's also very important to remember that political actors don't have free choices. They may have more leeway, but their choices are still constrained, and the range of options that they have in particular contexts are defined by prior conditions, by that context. So again, echoing what some of the things Maria was saying about specificity, contextual specificity. So we have to bear in mind the importance of differences in the initial conditions. It's absolutely crucial. So during critical junctures, political actors like presidents and prime ministers do have more leeway in their choices, but and are somewhat less constrained than they might have been. And institutionalist scholars generally look back over a long time frame at critical junctures, normally to see how the events have played out subsequently in the path dependencies. So work out, trace back and work out what's happened and what the important things were in the critical juncture. But of course, we're actually in a very different position now. We're right in the middle of the critical juncture. We don't know. We can hope and plan for a better future, but we don't know what the different outcomes and the path dependencies set in train now will look like in the future. And of course, we're seeing a range of different decisions taken for different reasons with different outcomes. And of course, it's very likely that we'll end up with outcomes that don't actually reflect what any specific actors wanted. I think we're likely to end up with unintended consequences, some foreseen, some unforeseen, some better and worse than others. So if we start from the point that actors and agency matters in this COVID critical juncture, then we can start thinking about how this plays out in gendered terms. And if we think about female leadership, which has come under the spotlight recently, we can see, we've heard all these arguments that female leaders have done better than male leaders, and examples of what they've done has been they've introduced appropriate risk-averse measures early. They've been more likely, it's argued, to lock down quickly. They've also, many people argue, tended to communicate more honestly and empathetically with their populations. So, for example, some female leaders have even given press conferences for children. And as a result of all these measures, the countries, it's argued, with female leaders have often had lower overall death tolls and an earlier decline in infections. And this has enabled them to ease lockdowns more swiftly in some cases than in others. So I think in all these discussions, there have been echoes of some of the debates we heard after the global financial crisis in 2008, where people started talking about, well, if Lehman Brothers had been Lehman sisters, would we not have ended up in this dangerous position in this global financial crisis, because women would have been much more risk averse than men. Now, I think there are a number of problems with all these arguments, and drawing any firm conclusions is very difficult for a number of important reasons. Firstly, we don't actually have that many women leaders to use as our kind of data, if you like. Only about 8% of leaders are women. I think some people have said it's total of 13 out of 193. So there's just not enough women leaders anyway for a robust kind of analysis. Secondly, the cases are so diverse. If we're trying to compare New Zealand and Iceland with a larger state like Germany that have women leaders, you've got what's the significance of being a small island versus a much larger state like Germany. So you've got these very different contexts. Back to this question of specificity, if there's not very many women leaders, there's certainly not enough comparable data to draw really robust conclusions. And I think also, over and above the lack of data and the small number of cases, also hugely significant is the observed tendency that lots of gender and politics scholars have noticed, that women often reach leadership positions only in already effective polities with high levels of trust in political institutions. Countries like New Zealand and Germany, and also countries where women leaders aren't kind of got rid of, the so-called glass cliff, whenever things start getting difficult. So it's not random, and it's not an accident then that the United States, for example, has had huge difficulties in electing a woman president, and the UK and Brazil has a history of ousting women leaders, whether by their own party or by impeachment, whereas Scandinavian democracies don't seem to find it so challenging, for example, to have women leaders. So that brings us to think about, really, is it more about the nature of the polity and the political system and political institutions than the fact of a woman leader that make these countries do well, if you like, in terms of COVID pandemic? So are we really thinking, or do we really need to think a lot more about the link between government quality and state capacity and state effectiveness and state effective governance and COVID outcomes? So people have talked about thinking more about the virtuous circle of government. How far in those policies do you have high trust in the government, a willingness to undertake measures like lockdowns, like wearing face masks and not traveling? And so how far is it in a country like Germany that you have Angela Merkel, who is a scientist by background, and Germany that is an effective polity that can actually countenance a woman leader for an extended period? I think she is the longest standing woman leader in office at the moment. And that is what's key to the COVID response. And on the other side, an American political scientist, Jen Piscopo, has recently written a blog, I think, about the number of women Republican state officials in the USA who have quite enthusiastically embraced the kind of Donald Trump position, or certainly what has been his position on the COVID pandemic, and not been terribly risk averse in taking all these measures, but have been as much in favor of the we're not going to be defeated by this virus line as men. So that brings us to whether it's perhaps more helpful to turn the question around to consider leadership in two countries, the United States and the UK, where I'm based, that actually were top of the 2019 global pandemic preparedness list, but have been seen to have done very, very badly in terms of their actual preparedness and effectiveness in dealing with the pandemic. So start thinking about, well, how come? How did this happen? How was it that the supposedly prepared countries have done badly? And if we are using this feminist institutionalist approach that sees this as a moment of a critical juncture when gender and agency comes to the fore, we can actually ask, how far did this perceived policy failures or policy fiasco even result from a particular form of leadership? And I think it's worth thinking about how far it's a sort of what we see as a hyper masculine leadership style. So not all male leaders are leaders in this ilk. It's a particular subset of male leaders. And I think, although it's not space to go into that here, it's also related to questions about how far sort of hyper masculine leadership styles and strategies are associated more generally with kind of contemporary right-wing populist politics, the kind of right-wing populist politics that are so important in many parts of the world, with such sort of negative consequences for gender equality, whether it's in Eastern Europe or parts of Asia. So what I'll do in the few minutes that I've got left is think very quickly about how this works in the UK case. If we think about the UK response to COVID, it's been very male dominated, certainly in terms of the politicians, the key government ministers, the people inside the Prime Minister Boris Johnson's private office, alongside the notorious Dominic Cummings. It's particularly male dominated response. But also think about how far their particular forms of hypermasculine leadership have shaped the policy making around COVID-19. For example, we've had very militaristic narratives of war. We've had lots of discussion about we're going to defeat the virus. In the early days, there was a lot of discussion about comparing the manufacture of ventilators, which we were going to do en masse, to the manufacture of Spitfire airplanes in World War II. Secondly, initially there was a great applauding of risk-taking. Boris Johnson, Prime Minister, initially proudly continued shaking hands with people in hospitals, wherever he went, until of course he contracted COVID, as we know, and ended up in intensive care. And initially, that's changing now, preventive measures were almost seen as a sign of weakness and giving in to the virus. So wearing masks, which we're now doing a reversal on, or locking down. And there was even a picture in the press a couple of weeks ago of Boris Johnson prompted to do press-ups on the floor of a pub, I think, to show how he'd regained his physical prowess after the virus. And a lot of people likened that press picture to one of Putin, pictured bare-chested riding a horse. And also we've had a lot of discourses about the autonomous, self-sufficient and plucky Brits are going it alone to defeat the virus. So policy choices have been justified with narratives about the unique scientific and inventive genius of the United Kingdoms, that we can on our own develop our own phone app, which failed, invent our own ventilators made out of hoovers, and tying in, of course, I think, to the whole Brexit discourse that we've had over the last few years, which again resonates with this Britain going it alone and British greatness. But crucially, all this has been facilitated by a context, an institutional context that Mariah's already hinted at, of declining government effectiveness and state capacity, with multiple causes, particularly a context of the running down of public services after decades of austerity, increasing inequality, declining trust in government, and an over-centralized government machine, which also these factors also played a role in Brexit and the support for Brexit. So all these factors have contributed to the policy fiasco that's kind of echoed in the States and Brazil and perhaps Russia. So in conclusion, the COVID crisis is a critical juncture, which in some contexts has facilitated sort of hyper-masculine leadership to play a very disastrous role. So in some very different contexts, particularly those of high trust, states with effective capacity, where women leaders have been able to mount a successful policy response, we've seen a very different outcome. But it's not a simple story of women leaders good, male leaders bad. Okay, thank you.
Thank you so very much, Dr. Velan, for this insight about the political leadership. It was just amazing how you summed up the hyper masculine leader and the women leadership, and your balanced view at the end. You didn't get biased over it. Thank you so very much. Next and our last speaker, but not the least, of course, we have with us Dr. Aurangzeb Alizai. He is currently serving as chairperson at the Gender and Development Study University of Balochistan, Pakistan. He has recently completed his PhD in Gender and Development Studies at the Asian Institute of Technology, Thailand. His PhD has examined the connection between hijras, the third gender, their gender nonconformity, citizenship rights, and vulnerabilities associated with their inadequate access to fundamental human rights in Pakistan. He is also a member of various standing committees working to improve women and trans persons' rights in Balochistan province. His teaching and research interests include citizenship studies, gender law and human rights, gender politics, and transgender studies. Today, he will discuss the impact of COVID-19 on the third gender community in Pakistan. Dr. Alizai, hand over to you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Sheila. Good afternoon, everyone. It's a great pleasure for me to speak here, and I'm very thankful to the organizers of this webinar. They invited me to participate in this webinar. My basically background, my PhD analyzed the link between citizenship rights, the third gender, or the hijras, we locally term them hijras, the third gender people in Pakistan, the linkage between citizenship rights, their gender non-conformity, and the vulnerabilities associated with their gender non-conformity or the limited access to citizenship rights in Pakistan. So my perspective is more sort of I focus on the citizenship perspective, looking at the citizenship perspective and how this citizenship perspective has impacted the hijras or the third gender person in Pakistan. The current pandemic, COVID-19, has impacted the third gender people in Pakistan. So I also provide a little bit background of this marginality, why we are here today. For me, it's a very important point to give a historical background of the hijras or the third gender people in the Indian subcontinent. Before the partition, the hijras used to enjoy very respectable status and the position in the Mughal emperor's in the courts of the Mughal emperors, where they were the chamberlains, where they were the warriors and the guardians of the harem. So once the British they came in, they basically eliminated those sort of social and the cultural and the economic uh, privilege given to the Ijuras due to the Mughal emperors. They basically foregrounded their position, and then they pushed them to the margins. Gradually, after the partition, the status quo or the legacy, the British legacy, continued. Uh, for instance, I can give you a few examples. For example, the Indian Penal Code 1860, the former colonies, India, Pakistan, and Bangladesh, in South Asia, they still continue the British legacy. Still, they have those laws in place, and a lot of the legal legacy is continued until today. And we haven't been able to disassociate ourselves from the British legacy. And also the ways I have also seen the ways how this legal perspective has influenced so much of the social, cultural, and the gender perspective. So, of course, I mean, we have talked so much about the current pandemic, how it has influenced. For example, uh, uh, if we look at the legal side, for instance, the Constitution 1973 of Pakistan, it says that there shall be no discrimination on the basis of sex. But that term, the term sex, it still needs to be elaborated. It still needs to be, it's a very ambiguous formation that it doesn't say anything. Ooh, I mean, it's made in 1973. There was not so much of the LGBT rights movement there, and not so much of the transgender rights movement. I mean, they have this the Khwaja Sara culture in the Indian subcontinent, but I refrain from using the term Khwaja Sara because it also continues a sort of privilege and a status which they may not be able to gain again in the current Pakistani scenario or even in the South Asian context. Uh, for instance, the sex, it needs to be elaborated, that the language of the legal language. My work more sort of analyze the legal language, how this legal language is more ambiguous and it doesn't provide any clear formations, and how this ambiguity gives a lot of room to the duty bound authorities, specifically to the police. They use this room and they can use it against the people, specifically gender non-conforming people, in this case the third gender, the transgender, the gays, the lesbians in this country. Though they are more sort of in closet, not so many people they come out. I mean the Western term we use, come out, it doesn't, we don't use it in the same way in Pakistani context. For us, it is not sort of a come out. Usually, that it is revealed to the parents somehow by the friends, or somehow by the school teachers, or some neighbors, or the maybe classmates or the peer groups. And then there's a lot of backlash or to this people who reveal, or who are more sort of, they reveal their identity to their parents. So I would like to give you a little bit context of the third gender people currently in Pakistan. For instance, the third gender people, when the hijras, when the parents, they know that they have gender non-conforming identity, so the parents, they kick them out of their homes, and they have to live with their gurus. With their gurus are sort of we use a term for the guru, that the sort of the someone who controls the hijras or their communities. So there are so many gurus, and they are divided in so many gurus. There is also a panchayat system, or the chaudhry system within the hijras. So these gurus, they not only control their body autonomy, but also they control their livelihood options. So once they leave their homes, they have to come to the gurus, where they mostly dependent, mostly they sustain their lives through few livelihood options. For instance, bagging at the road junctions. For instance, offering engaging in survival sex, or taking part in the male dominated wedding parties. Or they also have this role of collecting arms. We call it in Punjabi badai or wadahi. My Punjabi colleagues, they know it very well. So this collecting arms and wadai is very much intact in this place. But a lot of the changes they have drastically impacted their livelihood options, for example, and specifically in this COVID-19, for instance, they were not able to go out because of the lockdown situation, and and that the few options they had earlier, so they were not able to even avail those options, for example, bagging, or for example, going in the wedding parties, because of I mean, still a lot of the restaurants, the wedding halls, they are still closed. Still, there's a lot of demonstration and the protests going on in Pakistan currently. That the shopkeepers or the restaurant owners and the wedding hall owners, they are still protesting that they let them be open, and it has been a while that we have been deprived of our livelihood options. How would we feed ourselves and our laborers? So those few options, they were discontinued. They were so I mean, for a people, imagine for a while, if we imagine that for people who have only limited options, livelihood options, so how would they survive? So and of course, a lot of we also know that a lot of the ijras or the third gender people, they are very vulnerable to get to contract HIV infection and a lot of other infections. So the healthcare system, which Dr. Maria has focused more on it, I talk a little bit on it. So the healthcare system in a global south, a country like Pakistan, where the healthcare system is already very weak. It doesn't. I mean, for 100,000, there are only 7 or 11. I think there are only 11 doctors for 100,000 people. So how would it cater the needs of the transgender or the LGBT or the gender non-conforming people? They might come with different sort of infections, or they might come. They're more vulnerable than the general population. And how we can. I also analyze how a little bit more of my analysis was how this the vulnerabilities are different with taking into account the current pandemic. How these the unevenly or the distribution is unevenly distributed. The vulnerabilities or the impact is unevenly distributed among all these this strata of population. So and also a lot of people they were contracted with the HIV infection, so it was very difficult for them to have access to antiretroviral drugs or the medicine, and even taking hormones, for example. And also so my work basically has seen that how this citizenship, basically, it's not only, I mean, we have seen a lot of developments in the Pakistan during the last 2 decades. The Supreme Court of Pakistan took notice of the third gender or the hijra's rights in 2009, and then after that there were a series of hearings, and then they were given the rights. In 2018, we have a more progressive law, which is called Transgender Protection of Rights Act 2018. But still, we are still waiting for the implementation of and also how the legal follows the social, the cultural, and the economic, and the gender dimensions. I mean, for example, saying that someone is a legal member of a community, of a legal member of a political community. It's not enough to say that someone is a legal member of a political community. That the policies, I mean, as Dr. Georgina and Dr. Maria, they spoke before me, that the policies, they need to be there in the place. That how these policies, they are implemented. We do need the monitoring and the monitoring. We do need the implementation mechanisms, and also we need to know that we need monitoring mechanisms which can see how these are we can see that how these implemented. So we do need the monitoring mechanisms in the place. in also, so I would conclude I won't take much time. I just conclude my discussion with few what, uh, for instance, the uh, the change has to begin not only from the legal side, but it has to trickle down to the social and the gender aspects also. For instance, there's a lot of there's still a lot of resistance from the parents' side. They don't accept their gender non-conforming they don't accept their gender non-conforming children. And so this has to begin from the family. This has to begin from the state itself, where the state make an appropriate and clear review of the laws which are in place, which are basically one of the main reasons for the discrimination prevailing against the transgender, the third gender people currently in Pakistan. And we also have to sensitize the other organs of the government. So my argument in the whole thesis is that the binary, the gender binary framework after the British legacy has continued. Though the laws there are progressive laws, but this binary legal system, this binary formation of the family, for example, who is a family, for example, still we have this definition of family, a husband and a wife with the children, they make a family, or for example. Still, when I can quote one of my participants, when she went to receive the cash from the Assas program, from the Prime Minister's Assas program, or she went to receive the groceries from their own common, from the people who were helping their hands out to the people, reaching their hands out to the people. So they said that you don't have a family. Why you need the groceries? Why you need the cash? We are giving it to the families, and then still they have the binary definition of a family, husband, wife, and children, or extended family, for example. So we have to. I mean, it's a very critical point that this also provides an opportunity to review all those laws which are against those LGBT people, or the non-binary people, or the gender variant people, for instance, gender diverse people. So it's also a point where the states can have the review, a very clear and elaborate review of all those policies which not only discriminate in the paper, but also the implementation of those laws. The duty-bound people, they also discriminate, and then the way they implement it is so much discriminatory. I can conclude my talk. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Alizai, for highlighting comparatively less discussed topic in Pakistan relating to transgenders and LGBTs. Now the floor is open for questions and comments, but I would request you people to please be precise because we are running short of time, and you may raise your hands and we'll allow the question to you. So if you are having any questions, please raise your hands. Okay, so we are having a question from Miss Madiha Nadeem. She is a lecturer in LCWU Gender Studies Department, and currently she is in UK for her PhD. Miss Madiha Nadeem, kindly ask.
Hi, good day to all. Good to see you, Dr. Maria, and all other participants and speakers. My question is for Dr. Maria. It's very interesting. You discuss the narrative of normal, what could be the normal things. So I was just wondering if you can, comment on how we need to restructure our policies or economies in terms of security or pandemic in the future, so that we cannot see this kind of stuff which we have experienced in special reference to gender. For example, when we talk about security, it's just about weapons and other things, and in somehow people talk about food security or and other things, but we need to see this. Is it time to see it from gender or feminist perspective too? So what are your views about this? What do we want to see in the future?
Excuse me, before Dr. Maria says something, I would like to welcome the Vice Chancellor, Lahore College for Women University, Professor Dr. Bushra Mirza. She has just joined us. Welcome, ma'am. We are having the question answer session. Dr. Maria, please.
Well, thank you, Mediev. That's an excellent question and a difficult question because, of course, this is, I think, this is well, it's been said this is an extraordinary time, and I think it's difficult to know, in a way, we're still in the middle of this pandemic, I do think, and there are lots of measures being taken that are very much being taken at a kind of emergency sort of mode. So it's very uncertain. I think there's a lot of uncertainty about what will be some of the effects of the pandemic. When will we even begin to see perhaps an end to it, or something that looks like something that looks like a kind of after post-pandemic space or period. But I think what's, the question about what should be done in relationship to security is a very important one. And it's something that I think many commentators have suggested we need to really think carefully about. And it speaks to both environmental concerns. There has been, some reflection on how do we begin to think about the way that viruses move between animals and humans, and that this is actually a very common route for the development of new disease. And what does this say about how we relate to those places that are obviously and those moments where diseases occur in animals and humans are exposed? How do we think about this in a broader kind of ecological situation? What do we do? Do we how do we address that concern, I suppose? And there's been some writing, that suggests that, new diseases emerge out of moments of pressure on populations. Certainly there was a lot of concern around some of the SARS pandemics related to, how birds were kept. But I think there's actually an interesting moment here, and some geographers have written quite a bit about, how does the kind of crisis mode that we're in end up enacting certain modes of living with others, like animals, that actually we might not see as positive, and that have very particular effects for thinking about, sort of relationships with others. I think in terms of public health, what's been very clear is that, again, public health officials have lots to say to us about what we could and should be doing. But we can certainly see the kinds of political questions that have to be asked, and the kind of political debates that have taken place around, what looks like public health recommendations. And I think we've been exposed also to the kind of debates, which is interesting in a way, around science. Certainly in the UK here, there's been a lot of talk about how policies must be evidence-based. But of course, then we begin to see how those, that evidence is not always very clear cut. We began to see some debates around, what evidence do we actually want to enact, or evidence leads us to suggest that certain things are good to put in place, but how does that fit in with a kind of broader sense of what economic effects might take place? And in the US, that I think has been even more stark, the question of trust in science and trust in the kind of scientific evidence, and just how slow some of that evidence might, or the kind of process of assessing evidence, what that looks like. So I think, there are lots of actually interesting questions that we should keep at the forefront of how we're thinking about what is the future for, our societies. And I think, it raises lots of interesting issues that that all of us really should be concerned about. And that's not getting to some of the questions that were raised by the kind of brief overview I gave of what's going on in the UK. I think there's been a very clear sense that, that sectors like education and social care and resourcing for for some of the domestic and social problems that have, have become even more stark in this pandemic need to be resourced. And, will that be something that our political leaders will take beyond this? It remains to be seen, but I think there's been, one could argue, more visibility around some of those issues, and we should see that, I think, and I'm very optimistic in many ways. We should see that as something to not let go of the momentum in many ways that that this crisis has opened up. So yeah, that would be my answer. Not no easy solutions, but I think many things that are that raise open questions for us, and that we should continue to push forward.
Thank you, Dr. Fanon. We are having a question from Ms. Mehvish Kudus. Mehvish, please ask. So we are having a question from Ms. Farah Adil.
I can see her question in the text,
Okay.
or in the chat around NGOs, and I think that's just, I'll say briefly, because I think Dr. Alizai and Dr. Whalen will probably have interesting things to say about it as well, around what role do NGOs play. And certainly, we've seen a lot of activity here in trying to, certainly, and I'm speaking in some ways from Bristol, there's been a lot of effort from some of the leaders the leadership in the council who are looking at some gender issues to try to, really make more visible the work of NGOs that are looking at gender violence and health, and to try to, kind of enhance the information sharing around those organizations. But I think the critical question will be the economics of how these organizations are able to, be resourced in the future. But yes, I think that is a question that probably could relate to all of our, well, to some of our talks, certainly around leadership of in the political sector, but also around transgender concerns.
Okay. So we are having another question from Ms. Munisa Javed. Munisa, kindly switch on your mic and ask the question. Munisa. I think she is unable to open up her mic. We are having question from Mavish. She is here again, Mavish Kudus. Mavish, please ask the question.
Hello, thank you very much for providing me a chance to ask my question. Previously, my mic turned off, so I couldn't ask my question. Anyways, my question is actually, it's a concern as well and a question too. I have always seen women at the core of the care system, care and response system, whether that is as a, hello, can everybody hear me?
Yes, Mavish, carry on.
Okay. Thank you very much. I have always seen women as nurses, as care providers, as community care providers, even in family. We are living in a country where women are the basic health providers and caregivers in the families in Pakistan. So for me, this is a very crucial question that women, despite they are the main care providers, despite they are the main care givers and health responders, yet they are actually at the high risk of getting infections, employment failures, and sexual and reproductive health diseases, especially in this pandemic era of COVID-19. So, my question from every speaker is that how different governments may or should respond to these gender related issues despite their huge role as a caregivers, and how their role can be more acknowledged, as well as their role and their response can be more strengthened in terms of their agency and the response against the current pandemic. Thank you very much.
I mean, I can jump in very quickly here. I think one of the things that has come, certainly at the beginning of the pandemic in the UK context, was a recognition of the role of caring, both paid care in hospitals and care homes, but also unpaid care in the household. So we had a lot of discussion, as well as a weekly clap for carers, where everyone went out mirroring what happened in Italy and some other countries. And there was a feeling, certainly at the beginning of the pandemic, that care would be more recognised and better resourced, which has obviously been a problem in certainly times of austerity. But I think that has to be kept on the public agenda, because already I think in the UK there's signs that that recognition of the very important role of care, and that should be better resourced, and that care workers should be paid better, seems to be diminishing a bit. I don't know whether Maria feels that that's the case. So I think it's very important to keep the issues of paying for care properly in the paid sector, and recognizing the crucial role that unpaid care plays in the private sector. It has to be kept on the political agenda.
Yeah. Just to say, I would agree. There was, you know, a real sense that, and I think to a certain extent there's a continued, appreciation for the work of those who are in the NHS, and yet I would tend to agree. I would say, the kind of media coverage and the kind of, the sort of sense that actually, the work of those who are in these sectors, who are doing this kind of caring work, is so essential to our survival, has sort of fallen. I almost feel like there's a sense that people want to return to the way things were pre-pandemic. There's been a lot of discussion of kind of getting out and engaging in economic activity to consume and spend and really focus on the economic kind of dimensions of lockdown, really, and that has sort of been where a lot of the attention, the kind of media attention, has fallen. In a way, I would say the one kind of victory for recognizing the work of those who are in the NHS, that I think is really to be celebrated, but which affects both men and women who are working as migrants in the NHS, was the Prime Minister's decision to not charge migrants who work in the NHS what is now the basically a healthcare surcharge. That if you are not if you are working in the healthcare service and you have come from outside the UK and have migrated, you are basically being asked to pay not only your national insurance, which is the fee that the sort of tax that everyone pays to cover healthcare services, but to also pay an additional fee because of your migration status. And that was I think around £600 a year. So obviously, if you are on a lower wage, that's a more significant chunk of money. And that was basically cancelled for all those who are NHS workers. Now, one could argue that it should be just eliminated entirely. But I think, you know, the sense that actually recognizing this care as a way in which, and this comes to the question of citizenship, you know, the kind of role of those who are working in this country to support the NHS, to care for others who are in jobs that are really at the front line, and actually that, you know, their citizenship status is one of the ways in which those social differentiations are made, and are made really, you know, really kind of stark. So I think, yes, it remains to be seen whether this kind of attention to care work and the value and the revaluing of care work might continue beyond and into the future. But I think it's certainly, you know, it did have a high profile, and it needs to be kept at the top of an agenda, of all the policy agendas.
Can I just follow that up very quickly? Although I think in some ways the debate has shifted to a different form of instrumentalization, because now we're very concerned with childcare, and that if schools don't go back, then women, particularly mothers, won't be able to go back into the workplace, because women are 47%, the statistic I heard this morning, of the workforce. And so there is an instrumental element that if we want to get the economy going again, we have to get childcare going again, because otherwise women in particular won't be able to go back to work. So there's sort of benefits, but also the other side is it's not necessarily for women's kind of equality or rights, but for other agendas about rescuing the economy from falling over a cliff.
Yes, and I suppose women's, you know, their productive contribution to the economy. So yes, there's some more questions.
Sorry, we are just running out of time. We are having a lot of questions, but I'm really very sorry. I just can't take more questions. So now I would request Dr. Subha Malik, Chairperson, Department of Gender and Development Studies, to please conclude the session. Dr. Subha, over to you.
Yes. Okay. So, Dr. Shella, can you hear me?
Yes, Dr. Subha, we can hear you.
Okay. So thank you very much, everyone, for joining us on this platform today. We at the Department of Gender and Development Studies have tried our best to bring together gender specialists from diverse backgrounds so as to have an overview of the impact of COVID-19 on gender issues. This is the first of the international webinar organized by a department, but we are working towards another in which we will talk about gender issues in South Asia. Today, I'm very thankful to Dr. Faneen for discussing the medical issues related to gender. Professor Whelan very comprehensively talked about the leadership issues in COVID-19, and Dr. Alize for discussing the lifestyles of the third gender community in Pakistan. I would also like to take this opportunity to extend my gratitude to our Vice Chancellor, Professor Dr. Bushra Mirza, for her support in conducting this webinar, and the Department of MASCOM and Saptan Sahab, and our Director, Talat Sohail. So now I would like to invite Professor Bushra Mirza for speaking as for joining us in this webinar. She has been imparting education since the last 30 years and has been working as a professor for the last 20 years. She is the recipient of many awards, among which are the Best Young Research Scholar Award by HEC and recipient of past gold medalists and Tamka Imtiaz. She is currently the chair of ISESCO Women in Science Wing. I would request her to throw light on issues related to education and gender. So over to Professor Bushra Mirza.
Assalamu alaikum and good afternoon. Can you hear me? Okay.
Yes, we can hear you. Yes.
Okay. Well, first of all, I congratulate our Department of Gender and Developmental Studies and the organizer, Dr. Subha Malik and Dr. Talat Sohail, for organizing this wonderful webinar, and very thankful to our international speakers, Professor Georgia Whelan and Dr. Maria Finnan, and of course, Dr. Aurangzeb Alize as well for joining us. And I'm sure their talks have been very productive and fruitful, and a lot of learning experience for all our participants, our students and faculty members. Now, as far as this topic of gender dynamics in current pandemic is concerned, as Subha has very kindly introduced me as Women in Science Chair for ISESCO also, let me explain. ISESCO is basically an organization for all Islamic countries, and it's like UNESCO, deals with scientific issues and cultural issues pertaining to, and because I hold Women in Science Chair, so it's an honorary position in which I have been looking at the gender perspective of the women in science and higher education. Even though my basic field is biology, but I have been looking at that aspect as well in this position. So I feel that I'll talk from my personal experience and observation that on one hand, this pandemic has obviously the negative impact on the gender issue or the women, their survival and their professional responsibilities. Like, we see a lot of domestic violence increasing during this period, and a lot of additional pressure on women for being at home, as well as trying to deal with their official responsibilities. Because, as a vice chancellor here also, I got a lot of complaints from these students, because we are a women university and we have all female students, and they were complaining that it was difficult for them to continue online teaching, not just because of connectivity issues or other technical reasons, simply because when they are at home, families expect them to be involved in domestic responsibilities more than their brothers, So for boys, being at home and doing their academic or their professional work is easier than women being at home and, or young girls being at home and sparing time to give attention to their studies as well as to their work is kind of difficult. So most of the girls, they wanted to come to the hostel and stay here and continue their studies rather than studying at home, and finding it very difficult to spare time and focus on their work. So similarly, we also see that the economical impact of COVID-19, as we all see, is actually much more adverse for women compared to men, because most of the women, they lost jobs first than men, and obviously they're already at a difficult, usually economic situation, and any hardship situation, any such adverse situation impacts them more than men. And of course, some speakers or people who were asking questions, they mentioned that women are actually more vulnerable to getting infection because they are nurses or doctors. So there are lots of, we see the things making more difficult for women during this COVID-19 situation. But I see some positive aspect as well. For example, I see that on one hand, the contribution of women is being acknowledged as nurses or doctors, and their contribution is being acknowledged as leaders as well. Even in international leaders, we see like Germany or New Zealand, we see examples that women leaders have been able to deal with the situation probably better than some of the male leadership. But similarly, I see that women contribution is being acknowledged in this situation, which is very positive aspect. At the same time, I also see in Pakistan, I have been involved in some studies in my Women in Science Chair position, that what is the main factors which keep women not reaching to the topmost position as often as men do. And one of the, or couple of the main factors which we observed was, for example, it's difficult for women to reach to the top position because they are not good at networking. They are not as good at networking as men are. It's hard for them to attend to to go, abroad or even at national level to attend conferences is they don't feel very comfortable attending conferences. Similarly, it's hard for them even to travel to reach to their workplace, because they have to find, they have to face harassment on even on their way going to the workplace or so on. So and also sometimes we see that young women, when they're starting their profession, at the same time they're starting their families also, and it's hard to keep both commitments, going, starting their families and starting their profession, especially in science, in late 20s or early 30s. That is the time when you are starting your family, as well as that is the time you are starting your profession, and you have to write a lot of grants and research papers, which requires a lot of commitment to establish your labs or your attain your respectable position in academia or research. So these were like some of the factors we felt that are very important to be looked at. But in this situation in Pakistan, for example, I see, and same is I think in rest of the world also, that people are moving towards more online. And the very reason, if I look at today's webinar, we are having this webinar because of COVID-19, and we are able, otherwise, even though this facility was available, but probably we would not have explored this ability to get benefit from these eminent speakers sitting in Europe or US. And as I said, it's hard for female in our country to go abroad to attend conferences or workshops, because they have family commitments, and it's not easy to just go for even few days abroad frequently. So I feel that obviously, even after COVID-19, this culture which is being developed of more utilizing the IT facilities for such webinars and interactions through internet and social media is going to be very helpful, and it will have a long-term impact, on a very positive impact on women, their development, their learning, their grooming, and sorry. I'm sorry. Sorry, I think we have some, I guess I can continue. All right. So I personally feel that, I see use of IT facilities and using these platforms and using online teaching, working from home. This culture should have been developed earlier, but we didn't probably explore those possibilities because we didn't have to. And now we are doing it. And I'm sure this will continue even after COVID-19 is gone. We are talking about more sort of blended education or hybrid education, in which we will be depending on online as well as face-to-face teaching. And I personally feel that this will open up a lot more opportunities for women, and they will have more flexible working environment in this context, because usually in Pakistan, we don't have that sort of very flexible environment working concept. And most of the time when women have to take a couple of years off, it's very hard for them to go back to work, and or even work part-time is something which is very hard for them. And this is one of the reasons which keeps them at a very sort of behind men reaching to the higher positions. So that is why I'm saying that I personally feel that this COVID-19, I'm very confident that it will have a lot of positive impact on women in Pakistan, because they will have the ability to more opportunities to interact with other people, to learn from others, as well as to be able to work in their homes with flexible working environment, and without having to travel outside most of, sometimes just working at home in a comfortable environment. So I'm an optimist, and I think that these things are going to be very helpful for women. And now what we actually need is probably our government need to focus on making this informal sort of, working environment more giving it a formal shape, so that it is encouraged, it is it gets some formal shape in terms of regular career opportunity, as well as simply having for example, better connectivity, which can improve this work environment for women. So this is just my comments, because I personally feel that it will have positive impact in the long run. And if government has the right policies to encourage online working environment, working from home environment, this will be very positive step for women, and for institutions as well as for individuals. So with this just brief comments, I would again thank everybody who has been with us as resource person, and also I'm thankful to the organizers, and I look forward. And I can see there are lots of questions, and probably because of time limitation, some questions could not be answered, but I'm sure our resource persons would be available, and they would respond to their questions through networking, and they will be available for in future also for the guidance and support which our young people need. So I'm very thankful to all the participants and organizers for organizing this event. Thank you very much.
Thank you so very much, Dr. Bushra. Um, Now it's time to say goodbye. I would like to thank Dr. Wellen, Dr. Fanon, and all our respected teachers, colleagues, and students as well. Your active participation actually make this webinar very much lively and informative as well. Thank you so very much, everyone. So it's time to say goodbye now. Bye bye and Allah Hafiz.
Goodbye. Thanks, everyone.